Thank you for making Locked On Women's Basketball your first listen. Welcome to the Big Ten episode. Before November ends, it's time to answer the question, how do you stop the unstoppable? Big Ten reporter Eric Rynston-Lobel illuminates what teams are doing to slow down Caitlyn Clark.
Ogunbowale for the win.
You are Locked On Women's Basketball, your daily podcast on women's basketball.
Has three teams in the AP Top 25 poll. That's Iowa, Ohio State, and Indiana. So today we're going on a tour of the conference. First stop is Iowa. Eric and I will discuss the milestones so far this season, as well as dissecting how teams can stop them. Then we will head over to Maryland and to Indiana to discuss just how concerned fans should be at this point, if at all, for the two teams that could put up a hard fight come March Madness. Finally, our trip concludes in Illinois, or does it? We'll see. Eric will tell us the sleepers of the Big Ten, which may or may not include the Fighting Illini. I'm Gigi Speer, WNBA beat reporter and social media correspondent for The Next. As a former Division I softball player, I love diving into the details beyond the stat sheet, so hopefully we'll do that today. I'm joined by Eric. Eric has been a contributor to The Next since August 2022. He covered Northwestern women's basketball extensively in his 4 years as a student there for WNUR, and now works as a sport reporter for the Concord Monitor in New Hampshire. Today's podcast is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. All right, so Eric, let's get into it. We're going to talk about Iowa this whole first segment. Caitlyn Clark with a historic performance yet again, putting her up in very high categories, something that we aren't surprised about. She ties Detroit's Mercy's Antoine Davis for the most 30-point games in Division I college basketball in the past 25 years after her 30-point game against Kansas State. So, Eric, I want to hear from you. What have you seen from Caitlyn Clark this season and the kind of roller coaster ride that she's taken fans on?
Well, I mean, it's one of those things where, like, you watch her play every year, and then when the year ends, it's like, well, how could she possibly get that much better? Because since her freshman year, she's been averaging close to 30 points a game. I think this year, the big thing that I was looking at coming in was, what is she going to look like as the real leader of this offense? Because even last year when they went to the national championship game, you had Monica Sonano, who was a fifth-year player. You had McKenna Warnock, who was a fourth-year player, who she could rely on as kind of those leaders in the locker room, and she could do her thing. And obviously she still takes on a leadership role just given how good she is. But now Sonano and Warnock are gone. It's really her and Kate Martin and Gabby Marshall that are the most experienced ones. And it's on her shoulders to kind of lead the way. And I know something that she has talked about and Coach Lisa Bluder has talked about has been her improving her mental toughness and that intangible aspect of her game. Because if you watched her freshman year, sophomore year, she would get a little bit rattled on the floor. So I think the fact that she's been able to improve in that area has been a big reason why she's continued to have the level of success she's had. Because we know the talent is there. It's just a matter of continuing to hone those other skills on the margins to really continue to elevate her play.
Has there been a moment for you where you've seen that mental toughness click in a different way than in her earlier seasons?
I mean, I think you look at, like, you know, the fact that Iowa just beat Kansas State after losing to them less than 2 weeks before. I mean, she did not play great in that game. She did score 24 points, but it was on 32 shots. So she was not very efficient in that game. Kansas State clearly had a pretty good game plan of slowing her down. And then they play again on Sunday and she drops 32 points on 25 shots. So the ability to not let a bad performance against a team kind of snowball. And, you know, she's been pretty good at that, but just seeing that against a good Kansas State team, I think was impressive.
Absolutely. Yeah. And she was 2 for 16. You pointed that out in her article in that first game against Kansas State. So were you expecting her to completely bounce back in last weekend's tournament?
I mean, the odds are kind of in favor of that happening. I feel like, she's just such a talented player. And, we've seen how, especially again, she's gotten much better at just not letting things get to her on the floor. And, when you play Iowa twice in, what was it, 12 days or 10 days, you're probably not going to hold Caitlyn Clark down both times. It's just not going to happen. So no, it was not super surprising, but you never know, because sometimes a team's defensive scheme can impact how she plays.
Absolutely. And so she finished that game 32 points, 5 rebounds, 6 assists, 3 steals, 7 for 16 from the 3. And I want to hear from you too, as someone who covers the Big Ten extensively. What do you feel like makes her game so special? Besides, it seems like that ball really could enter the hoop from anywhere for her.
Well, I mean, that's the first part. Is the range is like most teams are not used to having to defend that far beyond the 3-point line. So that's the big one that people see. But she's an incredible passer, and I think people have talked about that, pretty consistently throughout her career too. I mean, right now she's 7.5 assists per game. She averaged almost 9 assists per game last year. She's just such a great passer, and it's the ability. Like, I remember Monica Sonano had said to me last year when I was talking to her about Caitlyn Clark, like, when you're in the post, you always have to be ready for the ball to come. And even if you don't think it's coming, she's going to find a way to thread the needle and get it to you. So just that ability is just something you can't really teach. And that's part of what makes her game so difficult to stop, is she's not only going to drop 30 points on you, she's going to find open teammates who don't even know they're open. So those are the 2 big ones.
Those are 2 huge ones. And for those other teammates on the floor too, the Hawkeyes are going to be without Hannah Stuelke, the sophomore from Cedar Rapids, and the team's second leading scorer again this weekend. Who do you feel like you're expecting to step up without, in addition to Caitlyn Clark?
Well, I think we saw Kate Martin last week, had a double-double. She's another player that's been around a while. She came back for another year. This will be her last year with Iowa. She's just kind of that steady presence who does all the dirty work that maybe she doesn't get a lot of credit for, but she plays a big role in the success of that team. And then I think, Iowa's going to need to get more out of Gabby Marshall. She's gotten off to a really slow start this season. So she's shooting just 31% from the field, which is 8% below where she was last year. She can be a very good 3-point shooter. She played very well in the NCAA tournament last year. So those are the 2 veterans. And then in the post, I know Iowa's been giving some more play to Sharon Goodman. She's been someone that's been on the bench a couple years. But Stuelke is just, one of the things that I was hoping to tap into is she's just so athletic. And I remember something Coach Bluder had mentioned was, I was coming off of having Monica Sonano in the post, and then before her, Megan Gustafson, who are both really talented, but Stuelke has a level of athleticism to her that neither of those 2 had. So she can kind of add an extra dimension to Iowa's offense that they haven't fully been able to tap into yet, but still early in the season, and she's only a sophomore, so a long way to go.
Long way to go. And Iowa, huge other milestone, 500th win for the head coach, Lisa Bluder, who has a 500 to 250 mark in 24 years with the Hawkeyes. So super impressive, but more Big Ten to come. In just a moment, we're going to talk about 2 teams that have high hopes come tournament time, but we want to discuss, should November have us worried at all? Today's episode is brought to you by Game Time. Download the Game Time app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. So as I mentioned, we're talking the Big Ten today, and there's a lot of news coming out of other conferences, including the SEC and the ACC, that Natalie and Mitch are going to tackle tomorrow. So make sure you tune into that episode. But Eric, let's keep going. I want to roll around to the rest of the Big Ten too. So I'm just going to throw out a school name right now, and I want you to just run with it and tell us the ins and outs if you can. So first off, Indiana.
So Indiana lost a couple weeks ago to Stanford. I think it was by like almost 30 points or more. They've won 4 in a row since. I think the big thing with Indiana is Mackenzie Holmes, one of the best players in the country. She's got a big homecoming tonight playing the University of Maine in Portland. But they're missing Grace Berger. Grace Berger was their point guard last year. She was kind of the glue to that team. And that's kind of been one of the areas where it's been, they've missed her, which has been a little bit surprising because the rest of the players around her are all back. Yarden Garzone, Sarah Scalia, Chloe Moore-McNeil, Sydney Parrish, in addition to Mackenzie Holmes. So something that head coach Terry Moran's talked about a few times so far this year is wanting to see the team improve its toughness and grit. And again, those kind of intangibles that differentiate how far teams can go in the postseason. But something with Indiana, I think it's important to keep in mind is, some people might be concerned about how they've played so far, even though they've only lost the Stanford game. Indiana may have peaked a little bit too early last year. They won the Big Ten regular season, but then lost in the Big Ten tournament to Ohio State in the semifinals, and then lost to University of Miami, Florida, in the round of 32. So, the cliche always is you want to be playing your best basketball in March, and I'm not sure Indiana was. So there's no real rush. They have the experience of winning a Big Ten title. They know what it takes. They don't necessarily have to do it again this year in order to make a deep run in the NCAA tournament.
Ooh, okay. Yeah, good point. And so that 71-57 win over Tennessee, how do you feel like that propelled them? That was the Thanksgiving win, and then they won over Princeton 72-63. How do you think that propelled them to the Princeton game after winning on Thanksgiving?
I just think it kind of gets that bad taste out of your mouth from that Stanford game because they had played 2 games between Stanford and Tennessee, but they're 2 games you're expecting to win by healthy margins against Murray State and Lipscomb. So going up against another top 25 team, a team that's probably going to make the NCAA tournament this year, most likely will, and beating them by 14, it just kind of gets that bad taste out of your mouth. I don't think anyone wants to make too much out of any single game in November in particular, but it just kind of, restore some of that confidence and allows them to continue to build because this team is not a finished product yet. Obviously, it's still very early. So getting that win, and then Princeton's a very good team. I mean, we cover that. I think Jen Hatfield covers that very well here at the Next. So they're ranked now. So Princeton's a great team. And so those are 2 good wins. And then tonight should be exciting, too, for Mackenzie Holmes to get to play in her home state.
Going back home. So true. And I want to spend a minute, too, and talk about Garzone. You mentioned her. She had one of her best performances. She had 23 points against the Volunteers, 5 of 6 shooting from 3, 5 rebounds, 5 assists. How do you feel like she is stepping up this year?
So, I mean, Yarden was unbelievable last year, 3-point shooter. I mean, she was shooting 46% from beyond the arc, which as a freshman is just, anybody, it's crazy, but especially as a freshman to come in on that team and do what she did. I'll never forget in the game against Miami in the NCAA tournament where she had a crossover step back 3 to tie the game late in the 4th quarter, which was just wild. But she's just really composed and unflappable out there. But she just kind of adds to that range of where teams have to worry about defending, where, she can shoot the 3, Sarah Scalia can shoot the 3, Sydney Parrish can shoot the 3. So having and then Chloe Moore-McNeil can knock them down too. So having 3 to 4 players that have that range and one of them be a 45% 3-point shooter her freshman season is really impressive. And she's back up to 47.6% right now, obviously smaller sample, only a month in, but she's just really talented and she's very quiet. You're not going to turn on an Indiana game and notice her right away necessarily, but when she starts draining a bunch of threes, you might start paying a little bit more attention.
Do you feel like that is a common theme among this Hoosier team where they might be a little bit quiet and not seem like they're talking a big game, but then they'll show it?
Yeah, and I think that just comes from Terry Moran and how she operates. So she's kind of that way. She's incredibly competitive. Any coach is, but she's really, really, really competitive. But she knows how much hard work it takes to be good in this conference and this sport. So they're never going to, go into any game feeling too good about themselves or not being focused on executing their game plan. Even heading into this game against Maine, listening to the media availability from yesterday with Coach and Mackenzie Holmes, it's going to be a big day for for Holmes going home. Lots of family and friends are going to be there, but they're locked in on this game. And that's just how this team operates, very business-like. And that's one of the reasons why they've had a lot of success over the last couple of years.
Yes. I mean, you're up in New Hampshire, like we talked about before, it's a little cold. Maine's a little cold. So it's not like they're going to the Caribbean. It's not going to be a beautiful, warm vacation. But still, if they were, they would be thinking about it in a business mindset. It's all business at this point in the season. So overall, you'd say November, very optimistic about Indiana?
I would say pretty optimistic. I still think not having Grace Berger is just tough. I mean, you losing your point guard who's as good as she is always going to be tough to replace in a year. But this is a team that's battle tested. And I think if you look at where the rest of the conference is, Indiana has pretty much just as much experience on its roster compared to anybody in the conference. And that goes a really, really long way in this league, in this sport. So I would feel pretty good about where Indiana is right now.
Okay. All right. And now I want to move over to Maryland. We talked about Indiana. And speaking about someone who's battle tested, Coach Brenda Frese's track record, like you mentioned in your article, it really speaks for itself and how she's able to turn a season around. So I feel like from following your articles, we've been kind of riding an emotional roller coaster with Maryland. So talk to me about that.
Yeah. So, I mean, Coach Freese knew coming into the year it was going to take some time to get things rolling because you're losing, Diamond Miller, who's one of the best players in the country, and Abby Myers, who was really, really good last year, transfer from Princeton. I mean, those are two players that went to the WNBA. So anytime you lose that caliber of talent off your roster in an off season, it's going to be tough. Having Cheyenne Sellers to step up as a junior now, and she was really good last year. She's been even better this year, 18 points a game, shooting over 40% from three, over five rebounds, 4 assists, 2 steals. So she's been filling up the stat sheet. But the real thing has just been getting other players around her to step up. And we can talk about this a little bit more. But, you mentioned the roller coaster. I mean, Maryland they've had a couple of games they got blown out against South Carolina and UConn, who are probably pretty good teams. But then, losing to Washington State, squeaking by Syracuse. So they've just been up and down. And again, this is another program where, like, does Brenda Freese want to win the Big Ten? Absolutely. But they can still be a 3 seed or a 4 seed in the NCAA tournament. And she knows how to get them playing their best basketball during that point in the season. So as long as they get into the tournament, you wouldn't want to play them. But it's a matter of getting there. And it's going to take some work because they're relying on players that are returners, but didn't necessarily have those roles last year of needing to be players that step up all the time. So, whether that's Faith Massonis or Lavender Briggs or Brene Alexander, Bree McDaniel, those are all players that were on the roster last year. And they haven't been consistent so far. And I think that's been the big thing because Cheyenne Sellers is really good. But you can't win with one player. You need, 3 or 4 players that are going to step up on any given night to help you win games. And they haven't really had that yet.
Absolutely. And we could talk more about Maryland in the next segment, but we want to say that today's podcast is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more. Right now, new customers get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 money line bet. That's $150 if your team wins. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. Okay, Eric, so this is going to be a fun segment. I'm a huge fan of underdogs. So I want you to just tell me if there's any sleepers who we should be paying attention to. I have a couple in my mind, but this is your conference, man. Run free with this one and just bounce around all those thoughts that you've been keeping in while you write these articles or whatever it might be. Let's hear it. Any sleepers in the Big Ten that we should know about?
So I have 2. I think one of them should not be a sleeper after last year, but they probably still are. That's Illinois. I mean, I wrote about them last year, and I've done a little bit this year too the job that Shauna Green's done in the year plus she's been in Champaign has been unbelievable. I mean, having the transfer portal helped and being able to take a top player like Makira Cook with her from Dayton to Illinois is a big boost, obviously. But Illinois was just dreadfully bad for so long, and to not only turn them around but take them to the NCAA tournament in her first season is just a remarkable accomplishment. And they return everybody pretty much this year. So Makira Cook is back. She's been dealing with some injury, so they need to get her healthy. But you have a player like Genesis Bryant, who's averaging over 20 points a game right now. You have Kendall Bostic, who almost averaged a double-double last year. She's a rebounding machine. She's at 8 rebounds a game, 11 points. Adalia McKenzie's a really good guard. They brought Camille Hobby over from NC State. She's averaging about 8 points a game. Bryn Shu-Piloff, who's been starting as well. So they have a lot of experience. And I said before that experience really goes along. We saw that with Iowa last year. They returned their starting 5 2 years in a row. They go to the championship game. And I think that continuity, there's just no substitute for that. You can have all the talent in the world, but if you don't have that continuity, it doesn't matter. And a team like Illinois, I think, is going to have that. Makira Cook needs to get healthy. But I wrote a column before the season about how I don't think it's out of the question that this team could potentially be in contention to win the Big Ten this year. I mean, they are that talented. Makira Cook is that talented. Shauna Green is a really good coach. I think they're going to have to improve their defense. That was a bit of a weakness last year, but they can score. And if you can score, you're going to win games because you can compete with teams like Iowa and Ohio State and Maryland when they're right, who can score the basketball really at a really high level.
Absolutely. 4-2 right now. So what do you feel like those losses that the Illini have been handed, what don't they reflect? What's something that the team kind of shows up and does even despite a loss?
Well, Makira Cook missed, I believe, both games that they lost. So not having your top scorer will definitely hurt. They also lost. I mean, Notre Dame's a very good team that they lost to. Marquette's a good program. So those are 2 losses that you'd rather not have, obviously. But I still think this is a team where, they're not going to get rattled. I think the big thing last year was, when you've been in a program that's had so much losing. I remember Kendall Bostic said this last year. They had a game last year against Indiana where they got off to a really bad start in the first quarter. It was 14-2 or something. And it can be very easy early in the season, bad program historically, to all right, here we go again. We're at Assembly Hall. We're going to get blown out. But they pushed that game to overtime. They lost, but they still pushed Indiana in overtime. And I think continually last year, they proved to themselves that they can beat and compete with really good teams. They beat Iowa a few weeks after that. So I think this is a team that's not going to get rattled. And so they may have lost twice already, but they know what it takes to win games. And again, there's no real replacement for having that experience under your belt.
Experienced teams definitely make it far in the season and definitely in the postseason. And speaking of knowing what it takes to win, Penn State just lost by 1 point to USC. What do you feel like could have sent them over the edge and given them the win at the end of the day?
Well, I mean, when you look at a 1-point game, there's so many, whether it's a missed free throw in the second quarter or a turnover, any of those things could be a difference. But I feel like Penn State should less focus on what that one play or two was, and more just the fact that again, that's kind of that loss for Penn State is not that much different from that loss Illinois had at Indiana last year. We're playing pretty well early. You have a first real test. How do you perform? And Penn State pretty much passed the test. They obviously would have liked to have won, but when you're playing a top 10 team and you're not ranked and you haven't made the NCAA tournament in almost 10 years, that's got to make you feel pretty good. And Penn State, a team that I thought could be pretty good coming into the year. Coach Carolyn Keeger really hit the transfer portal hard this season. Several players coming in. They also have 3 returning players that are really good. Shea Chesky, McKenna Marisa, Leilani Kapanis, who are all really good and talented players. The offense has been terrific for Penn State. So that's another team that I would keep an eye on for sure as we move into the Big Ten season.
Okay. And speaking of offense too, I want to talk about Northwestern. Caroline Lau, who I know personally from high school. I went to high school with her brother, and I remember I was so bad at basketball and she was so good, and she was so much younger than me. Now I'm checking back in on her, sophomore at Northwestern. Crazy stats. And I mean, the assists that she's racking up to, how have you seen her be able to rack up the assists despite huge point differential losses for Northwestern?
I think it's two factors. I think one is just the way Northwestern's roster is right now. Like she's their best passer, and so she just gets the most opportunities to assist shots. So it's partly a volume thing, but also just she's a player that I think head coach Joe McEwen's been really high on since he recruited her. Northwestern obviously had Veronica Burton there for 4 years, who's one of the best players the program's had. And she was just one of those players that did all those small things really well: passing, defense, transition scoring, taking charges. And I think Coach McEwen has seen some of those qualities in Caroline Lau. I don't think she's fully there yet. And Northwestern had a tough loss yesterday against Loyola Chicago at home. But she's a player that, if Northwestern's going to rebound from last year when it finished last in the conference, she's going to be a player that's going to have to be right in the middle of it, because she's somebody that they're really relying on to be able to build the program around.
Absolutely. And it's tough to lose to someone that's so close to you in proximity. And before we go, I want to give you the open floor too. If there's any teams that we didn't talk about that we missed that you feel like we should pay attention to throughout the conference. Obviously, conference play hasn't started yet, so it's hard to gauge right now, but that's what makes this part of the season so fun. So, Eric, any other teams that you want to mention?
Yeah, I haven't written about Ohio State really yet this year, but I feel like they're worth mentioning because they went to the Elite Eight last year and they beat UConn. So, Kevin McGuff has done a terrific job building up that team. Cody McMahon was terrific last year as a freshman. And they have so many other talented players around her. I mean, McMahon was, as a freshman, kind of like Yarden Garzone, just so poised and confident and just kind of played above her years. And then you have somebody like JC Sheldon coming back, who's a really good scorer, but also fits their defense really well. And Taylor Theory. So they're a team I would not sleep on. They did lose to Southern California to start the season, haven't lost since. Another team with a lot of experience. So certainly keep an eye on Ohio State as well.
Yeah, and that blowout over Cornell definitely helps too. Eric, thank you so much for joining us for Locked On. Where can everybody find you, and what should we expect from you in the coming weeks?
Well, you can find me on Twitter. I think it's below at @EricR_L. I have my weekly roundup for the Big Ten, where I kind of go through a few of the big headlines from the week. I'm heading over to Portland tonight for the Mackenzie Holmes homecoming, so I'll have something from that game as well. So definitely keep a lookout for that. That should be a fun game to be in the press row for.
I'm so excited to see all the content that comes out of that. Eric, thank you so much. That wraps up this edition of Locked On Women's Basketball. Tomorrow on the show, Natalie and Mitch will be diving into drama, storylines, everything ACC and SEC. And let me know your thoughts on today's topics. Who are your sleepers in the Big Ten? How can teams stop Caitlyn Clark? How good is Indiana? How good is Maryland? And let's talk Big Ten. Find Eric, like he mentioned, at Twitter, EricR_L. You can find me at Twitter, Gigi_Speer. And find the Next Hoops on Instagram at the Next Hoops on Instagram and TikTok. And sign up for a Subtext subscription by following the link in this episode description to chat with me directly anytime and get one-on-one Q&As, breaking news alerts, and recruiting scoops, draft news, trade news. Have a great day and see you tomorrow.